Right. Should we go through some actual attempts to define cults then?
Sure. Yeah.
We should.
Yes, please. I'd love that.
Fucking do it.
Right. So we're going to start off with like the comedy version, because it got mentioned shortly after I joined the chat server where all this stuff gets organized. Are you going to bring up Stephen Hassan? Stephen Hassan is a now infamous self-proclaimed cult expert.
He's a hypnoturf.
That guy!
This is so good.
Oh my god, that guy! Oh my gosh, does anyone have the tweet?
Someone you can actually brainwash people with Pornhub videos.
Now he got famous because he said that MAGA is a cult, which is arguable, right? But then he has a bunch of crank beliefs, and one of them is that being trans is a cult. And he quoted J.K. Rowling with a tweet. I'm sure someone will quickly find. Saying that he had watched a bunch of sissy hypno porn and was convinced that trans people are a cult.
He knew, it started having an effect on him.
And he described it having an effect on him, right?
Yeah, he said he had to pause regularly to stop himself from getting sucked in and sucked.
I mean, it's like, he's a big telling on himself there, you know. Like, but I feel like he's maybe telling on himself about things he doesn't realize about himself just yet.
I hope this doesn't awaken anything.
You might
in
be
me.
right.
I'm so glad that he did that tweet because it gave a name to a genre of turf I had already been seeing in arguments for a while that I call hypnoturfs. Turfs who mention sissy hypno porn as proof that trans people are hypnotizing people.
Yeah, absolutely. Fucking rules.
Phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. So that guy.
Has there been an equivalent? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
No, please.
No.
I'm saying some trash. I'm just saying trash. Don't worry about it. Keep going. I'm very trash today, so ignore me.
Right. So to understand why Stephen Hassan is actively shit rather than just bad at posting, what you've got to understand is he's not. Although he self-describes as a cult expert, what he's actually an expert in is essentially selling books.
Yes.
He claims to be a proficient, what's called an exit counselor for people leaving cults and things that one might describe as being similar to them. However, people who are actually involved in that in a more serious way, who are actually doctors, their view of his writing is that he's not displaying a generally good way of approaching things. He's quite prescriptive. And the general feeling within the unfortunately you have to use the word industry because it kind of is. It's an offshoot of the medical industry because it's functionally counseling. The general view is that he skirts malpractice a lot.
Yes.
Now, the thing that he's mainly known for on an intellectual basis is this thing called the bite model, which is like a model with which one can ascribe various different characteristics to a relationship or a group, and if it fulfills enough of these, then one might reasonably describe something as being a cult.
I'm familiar with this when we did a cult stream the other day, or last year. And this is the thing that like I struggled with because I was like, well, then I feel like it doesn't go. It seems like there's a lot that's. It feels very fuzzy. It still feels very fuzzy, and it feels like it's not as accurate as it should be.
It's super broad. Coincidentally, if you wanted to sell a lot of books and charge people tens of thousands of dollars to do exit counseling for their relatives who might be in cults, it would be a very wise idea for you to create an extremely scientific model of diagnosing cult membership. That included just about every form of negative behavior under the sun. I like how they just listed murder at the end.
That's one of the bad things. That's one of the bad behaviors that you could be doing.
Basically, BITE stands for behavioral, informational, thought, or emotional control. We could scoot through it, and there'd be various different subcategories. To be fair, some of it's legit. My standing on the BITE model is that in any kind of like serious technical or intellectual discussion of how cults work, it's basically useless. In moderately serious conversation, you could use it to describe some general characteristics. I don't imagine that anybody who's doing serious counselling work would be well advised to use this because of how broad it is.
Not to mention that, like, and I don't know how anyone else feels about this, but you could qualify the state as a cult. You could qualify any state as a cult with
Steve Hassan says that China is the biggest political cult in the world.
Oh.
Technically, according to the bite model,
What
I
does he
would
say about
probably,
America? Yeah.
you know, but like I don't think
Right.
that's a really valuable distinction to make,
So
especially
if we
when you don't
want-
apply it
if-
to America. It's ridiculous.
Capitalism's a cult in that case, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, I did see a comment in the stream earlier on before it switched over to Red Planet mode, because I kind of like flicked on for a second to see what it was like, and somebody was like, "Will the cult discussion touch on neoliberalism as a death cult?" I mean, I guess like on a kind of like tangential level we will, but no. Sometimes things just get too fucking big.
They're really
going
big,
back
shitty
to-
ideologies. Just really big,
Yeah,
shitty ideologies.
going back to the point about hegemony, I think one of the key characteristics about cults is that they have to be marginal.
Yes.
Yeah.
So they can't. What
and-
you mean by that is they can't just be like the dominant thing everywhere, and then you can call it a cult. Is that what you mean by that? They have to be like something that is like a group that has some sort of borders to it.
Yes, in fact, borders are a critical structural component of cults.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
Can I say this actually the fact that it has to be marginal relates to something that they discuss a lot in Culture of Conspiracy, which is stigmatized knowledge. So like a lot of stuff that is true and good exists and moves through the spheres of stigmatized knowledge. For example, all leftist theory, being an anarchist, relies on a ton of stigmatized knowledge that is not authorized by mainstream authorities. But a lot of people go wrong in trying to distinguish between conspiracy theories and stuff that's true, right? To revisit the fact that I don't like creating conspiracy beliefs very much, like even though it's mostly fine psychologically speaking, they have this definition of a conspiracy theory as being like not in line with the mainstream account, having greater explanatory power, and framing the people who benefit from the lie as being the ones perpetuating the lie. And I'm like, right, so the genocide of Palestinians then is a conspiracy theory according to your definition, right? This is where people run into like, so it has to be that realm of stigmatized knowledge, right? Like that's what I was trying to get at.
It's really complicated too, because like when we're talking about like knowledge that we're gaining or not gaining, this is made especially more complicated by the fact that so much of the knowledge that we're accumulating, the information we get, is not it's not a primary like with our own eyes and ears. We're getting it on like by somebody else. I got it from somebody else, and that's like I don't leave my apartment ever anymore. Like I leave once a week, and yet I'm still being exposed to a massive amount of information about what's happening around the world. And so I think that kind of complicates things and it helps to feed into that conspiratorial thinking.
Oh yeah.
The internet has been a huge an unmeasurable boon for conspiracy theories, because the barriers between authorized and stigmatized knowledge have completely dissolved.
Well, that was it. Like I remember that very, very clearly when I first started getting into conspiracy theories when I was about 17, because I was just smoking like fiberglass sprayed weed every day. And yeah, I was
smoking
really
weed straight from the bike shop.
Really,
that's illegal in this country.
I know,
and therefore wrong.
It made me fucking gay. And so basically, like, yeah, so like my friend was like, oh, you should watch this thing, and you probably know about this. It's called Zeitgeist. You should watch
Yes, Zeitgeist. You know, they've made multiple sequels to Zeitgeist.
They have.
Yeah, they've like updated it sort of thing.
The people who tell you to watch the first Zeitgeist never to tell you watch Zeitgeist Addendum, where they literally debunk all of the conspiracies that are laid out in Zeitgeist, and it's absolutely ridiculous.
Amazing.
And then like, so when you know that Zeitgeist is like on the internet, you're like, oh my god, like there's this world of like stuff that I can research, and it's only on the internet because the internet is crazy and it's kind of illegal. There's illegal stuff on there. So yeah, and it really like entices you to like go in and like have a look at this stuff. Yeah, it's the idea of stigmatized knowledge. Yeah, fully.
I think there's like there was
the what? Sorry.
The ultimate role-playing game. So a lot of people who do research into QAnon have noted that there's like a game-playing aspect to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Particularly with the
definitely.
Construction, the ongoing and continuous construction of the belief system, which is referred to as like baking.
Yes.
If you like, I think getting too deep into the weeds with QAnon specifically would be a bit beyond the scope of this evening.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
My standing advice for people interested in that is to go and listen to QAnon Anonymous podcast, who do genuinely world-class research on that group.
QAnon Anonymous is a really good book.
Yeah.
I'm sure that you're desperate to get onto better definitions of cults. So I'm going to tell a really quick story about a really quick funny thing about Steve Hassan, and then we can power ahead.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
When I was getting my list of my pile of books that are relevant to the script I'm currently writing to show them on screen, I pulled one book out and tossed it away onto the sofa. That book was BreadTube Serves Imperialism by Caleb Maupin. I wasn't going to recommend it. I'm still not recommending it now, but it was in my pile of books for obvious reasons.
I believe you have.
And
yeah.
Dr. Steve
really
Hassan
funny.
is named in this book as the guy who is puppeteering BreadTube from the shadows. Because apparently, according to Caleb, he is consulted with more than one BreadTuber and is feeding us information to how to control people.
By a sissy hypno.
Probably.
Yeah.
Like
wow, that's really giving him too much credit. Fuck me.
Yeah, I totally I didn't need his help to help me start making sissy hypno.
How much is he paying you, Tim? Like, you know, should I get involved? Should I give him a ring?
He owes me, is what I'm saying.
Oh, what the
Honestly,
hell?
Muel, if you want to get into the big bucks, like you got to get the money that George Soros pays me to go into women's bathrooms and film myself jerking off.
Well,
that's
the thing.
what
I want to know where my Soros money is. I've been being anti-fascist on Twitch for years now.
I know, right?
What's going on?
None of it's on Twitch. Bezos has driven Soros from the platform with his powerful.
That makes sense. That makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Shall we carry on with the presentation?
There's a really.
Should we talk about some cult researchers who are actually smart and know what they're talking about?
Yes.
Yeah, we should do that.
Right. So there's a couple. I'm going to only name like a couple of them by name, but there's a wide range of people who look into this right now. I'll probably name some more contemporary people as we sign off, like people who you can follow on social media who actually look into this stuff like day to day. But back when like what we now consider to be cult research was beginning to kind of like take off in the 60s and 70s, one of the main people who eventually became like quite influential and respected was a person called Robert Lifton. Robert Lifton wrote some of the initial kind of like descriptions of what he called ideological totalism, which was basically this concept that he had, which was designed to describe what we would colloquially refer to as brainwashing. And he did a series of studies where he was essentially interviewing people who'd been subject to struggle sessions during the Cultural Revolution. And this essentially was like chewing through like loads and loads of interviews with these people to figure out like what happened in these struggle sessions, what was going on, what was the process by which like the Chinese Communist Party's like Cultural Revolution model was attempting to like change their manner of thinking. He was essentially trying to describe what he called thought reform. And the idea behind ideological totalism was that it was kind of like the overarching umbrella behind thought reform and behind the formation of like a mass ideological cult. He described this as the coming together of immoderate ideology with equally immoderate individual character traits, an extremist meeting ground between people and ideas. You'll notice the adjective immoderate, and I'll remind you of my remarks about hegemony and normalcy and what ideas become dominant. It's also worth noting this was an American man describing the communist Chinese during the 60s.
Yeah, absolutely.
There is a certain viewpoint that this stuff is coming from. However, I mean,
even the word brainwashing like entered popular discourse because I think it was Korean or Vietnamese like American prisoners of war who started sympathizing with the people who were experiencing an imperialist war of aggression. They must have been brainwashed. That's like when we started really using the word.
This is so similar to the
that series of news stories was part of Lifton's motivation for doing this research. He wanted to know what had happened there. To what extent was this legitimate, and if it was legitimate, what was happening? But the bulk of the more successful parts of his research was actually done on people involved in the Cultural Revolution, as I said.
Oh yeah.
I think the useful stuff that we can take from Lifton, having tweezed out the liberalism, is that he essentially describes like large mass ideological cults as essentially like flourishing off the basis of control over the milieu, manipulation people's like spiritual lives, demanding ideological purity from them, coercing confession in order to like further like steal that ideological purity, and then like the construction of like more sophisticated ideologies out of these like systems of psychological repression that would produce these confessions, and this would produce what he called a sacred science. Those of you who are familiar with like the stories about Heaven's Gate or the People's Temple, the phrase sacred science will really kind of like jump out at you. We've just referred to the QAnon practice of baking, and like baking breadcrumbs. That's their equivalent of sacred science. They're carrying out an intellectual task, and the purpose of the intellectual task is to reproduce the ideology.
I've forgotten the name of it right now. Someone might remember in chat. There was actually a Behind the Bastards episode about these guys, but there was a cult that came out of a Narcotics Anonymous. That like not group, me. Not like one group, but like the whole structure of groups, because they started doing stuff that was very similar in practice to like struggle sessions or whatever, which they called the game, where they were like just berating each other and just being horrible to each other, and like
Narcotics Anonymous and Alcoholics Anonymous use the same. So we'll get into this when we get kind of like later on, and I talk about what I think is a useful model for this. But NA and AA both use an internal model of reproducing themselves that is functionally not particularly different to most successful cults.
Right.
I'm actually going to take a run and just grab a book, because one of the ones that I've been taking notes from is a little bit too far away. So I'm back in just a second.
Yeah, it might be it's called something like Synanon or something like that, or I'm forgetting the name of it right now. But yeah, like the good outcome that we hope for from Alcoholics Anonymous is in many ways just like a kind of laid back cult, right? Like that they tell you how to think, but that's what you're there for. They tell you how to behave, but that's what you're there for. And then like they keep on checking in on you and following you around and expect you to go to a chapter wherever you end up moving to, like the rest of your life. But that's what you want, kind of.
There's I mean, like you get like groups like Narcanon who like are a Scientology group that use Narcotics Anonymous to as like a kind of like a recruiting tool for their basically. So it's like it's a wild thinking that it's like like there's not too much difference between like the business model and a lot of these things, I guess.
No, indeed. I mean, people also might make comparisons with what is it, Avon, the thing with the makeup?
MLM marketing.
Mary Kay.
Yeah, like MLM marketing schemes and the spread of cults is quite kind of similar, especially on the margins.
You're right. All makeup is a cult. Yeah.
Well, let's not. Yeah, that's just another discussion about hegemony. We've already touched on that
one. But yeah, I think that MLMs is a really interesting thing. There's actually a line that I have in my script, which is like, we need to talk about the economics of conspiracy, because if you want your conspiracy to grow to a cult, or your cult to grow to an MLM, or your MLM to be a full-blown religion, or at least like a modern reactionary fascist sect of Christianity, then you need people who are dedicated grifters, right? And like I think that there's been a lot of thought on how MLMs and cults can very directly like overlap, right?
Yes. So I've picked out a particular case study that we'll talk about towards the end that very much closely touches on that. Going back to Lifton, so basically he had this idea that ideological totalism was the thing that was the main like driving force behind the creation of like repressive ideological systems that one might refer to as a cult. So this totalism would like generally follow a path that he kind of divvied up into eight general bits, and it starts off with milieu control, which I mentioned earlier. So my general opinion is that Lifton's description of milieu control renders Hassan's description of the Veit model redundant, because basically Lifton covers all of the stuff that Hassan attempts to, but is much less prescriptive. He characterizes the control over a milieu as being like chiefly concerned with controlling the internal communication and transfers of ideas within that group, whilst also controlling that group's exposure to external ideas and ability to communicate autonomously with the outside world.
Jesus Christ.
And this might be this might be a tricky extra note, but I think that we've started using the word milieu without necessarily defining it for people, and it's a word that actually comes up a lot in conspiracy and cult research to do with, you know, it's a word. I mean, I'll give a crack at it, but like, it's to do with the like milieu control is being able to, exactly as M just described, like control all the information and where it's moving within people. So a milieu is like both a set of people and what they believe, right? So we talk a lot about the cultic milieu, and that's not just the audience, it's not just the beliefs, it's the combination of the two. So it's these people are predisposed to believe in conspiracy theories, and these are the conspiracy theories they believe in. Together that forms the milieu, and someone might go between and be focused on different conspiracies, and a milieu is a good term for it because it's such a messy structure and it doesn't have this kind of shape. The shapes that come out are to do with individual organizing around specific charismatic leaders or political goals or someone.
Yeah, one might describe it as being a subculture in the same way that, like, you know, goths are a subculture, but without being as clearly delineable. And also it would have, whilst not being clearly delineable in the social sense, it would still have an internally hegemonic ideological system in the context in which we're talking about them anyway.
Yeah. And one of the points of American conspiracy theories and of a culture of conspiracy is that, good news, Nicole, Americans and America is particularly nurturing of the cultic milieu and has an incredibly fertile ground for that shit.
No way.
But yeah, I think you and I, we've both said, like, we spent a significant portion of our misguided youth in the cultic milieu, like bouncing around between different conspiracy beliefs.
Particularly like online left-wing millennials, I think are particularly vulnerable to certain kinds of conspiracy theories.
I think also
very true.
Like, I would say in my generation of people that were kind of like getting online and, you know, getting into like you know, I would say like kind of non-mainstream online spaces, a lot of it was dominated by like conspiracy nerds. And like, you know, I'm thinking like in like the late 90s, early 2000s and stuff, like if you were going online, you were like talking about games, or like you were like looking up weird kind of hacker kind of stuff. There was like, it was dominated by people. I would say like a lot of those spaces were run by people who are a little bit older and a little bit more paranoid, and, you know, like some like, you know, these like American people running website servers, like fucking, you know, like message boards about niche music genres, whether it's like grindcore or like goth industrial stuff or whatever. And there would always be this significant presence of like, you know, like on every message board there would be like a conspiracies forum or some shit like that. And a lot of people I know that grew up in those kind of, you know, on those kind of like online spaces have become leftists since then. But I think it's just kind of like part of the DNA and a lot of that kind of like weird early internet stuff, you know.
Well, it's to do with exposure to stigmatized knowledge and how much you're seeking it out. I try not to
Pixel Cooker is saying the alt section of Usenet were full of this stuff back in the day. Yeah, I'm absolutely thinking about that kind of thing, you know.
Oh shit, TimeCube. Fuck, I haven't thought about TimeCube in such a long time. I try not to talk about this publicly too much because it is deeply cringe. But when I was like maybe a preteen or maybe like 13, 14, I was into the people who are practicing Jedi, like the early internet forums. It was entirely text based. If you wanted to see an image, it would have to, like, they didn't have the functionality for that in the site at all. You had to be like properly sending and downloading files. And it was this like Jedi forum, and I was super into it because I was like a nerdy little kid. But when it got down to trying to explain why they sincerely believed that the Force was real and that Jedi shit was real, their way of explaining it was immediately to go to like, these things are true and the government covers them up and don't want they don't want Like, I remember really clearly that the first time I saw X-Files, I was confused and excited because the picture of the hand with the little red glowing spot on it that's in the title sequence of X-Files was like an image I was familiar with already from the Jedi web forums. They were saying that it was like that's like an energy signature from the Force or whatever.
Jesus.
Nice.
It was everywhere.
So they just obviously like stole it from the X-Files because the X-Files tagline is the truth is out there, you know? Like
it was just one of those things that was bouncing all around the internet all the time.
Oh,
anyway.
that's phenomenal. I love that. I love that so much.
Sorry for all these derails, Em. I know you have cool and intelligent things to say to us, and I'm just like, remember Jedi forums?
I once thought the Force was real.
Honestly, like it's almost like on topic for particularly the discussion of like modern groups, very much so, because it's just such a classic thing that there'll be just one of these weird little melting pots where just all of this stuff gets cooked up.
Yeah.
I wasn't involved in that stuff personally, but I do remember that being a thing. I think when I was about that age, I probably would have been playing RuneScape like a wholesome young man. Right. Okay, so milieu control.
Yes.
I hate that word. I'm never sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Me neither. Never will be.
Essentially, the name of the game there is that the ideology as a system. What you got to understand here is that like cults are not fully run by their leaders. Cults are self-managing systems. They're information systems that exist in the same way that an amoeba would exist in a pond. They feed on things and they self-reproduce. The ideological system is essentially attempting to establish ownership over the shared perception of reality of the individuals within the social group. That's what's going on with the milieu control thing.
Yes.
And then subsequently, once that's kind of like been reasonably well established.
Sorry to just. So this is, I think, is pretty important, right? You're controlling what reality people live in. Like that's a really fundamental thing that's happening here.
That's really important to say.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? Like changing the way that people are perceiving a lot of things, you know, like the information that they're getting in or whatever. You're changing the lens that they're viewing the world and interpreting this.
But
I'll tell you about like one of the first times I ran into a real life cult, like a famous one. And this was one that had got into the news. I didn't get deeply involved with digging into them because they're extremely fringe and small, and they've kind of basically been taken out of commission by a result of how they got into the news. This was a major news story in the UK a few years ago. But basically, there was a house, I think, somewhere either in Birmingham or North London, where it got raided by the police, and suddenly there was a huge news story because it was one of those cases where some people had essentially been being kept in the basement for a few years.
Yeah.
And it eventually emerged that the reason why they were being kept in is because they were all part of an extremely hardline Maoist sect. And
nice.
Some of the core beliefs of this Maoist sect, which was run by one guy who was engaging in various different forms of abuse towards the other people in the sect, who, if I remember correctly, were all women. I don't think there were any other men involved.
Of course.
Yeah.
Basically, the reason how he was able to keep them inside of the house was that he had constructed such an incredibly complicated set of core reality foundational beliefs that he was able to convince them that he had like a telepathic system of communication with a satellite that had been launched by Chairman Mao that could communicate with a laser.
And it's wild because it sounds so ridiculous, but this is something that these people actually believed. Like that's how
they believed that they were in like an apocalyptic, determined struggle against empire. They had to defend, the revolution, the oncoming worldwide Maoist revolution.
I'm so sorry. I keep like bursting out in laughter, but it gets like so like, oh, I can see how these people might have got into this kind of thing, and then all of a sudden someone's like, oh yeah, I'm talking to a satellite. Do you know what I mean? And it's just so unreal. Like, how does it get?
But, I mean, it's like the same thing with like all these other groups like Scientology and stuff. When you hear their beliefs just out of nowhere, like us as outsiders, we're like, that's ridiculous. But a lot of these things they built up over like a long period of time through people that they've already established like strong bonds with.
Don't they come in hard though with Scientology? Don't they come in hard and be like, we're gonna? Oh, do they not?
No.
Okay.
They definitely don't.
It takes like a long time of like building up, yeah,
Money.
like fully integrating every aspect of your life into Scientology, paying huge amounts of your own money, investing into this thing as you slowly kind of like,
There was
so you're
really important, because once people have invested money, they become really, like, both consciously and subconsciously embarrassed to say that they
absolutely,
Right.
You notice this a lot if you've ever had like an elderly relative who gets involved with some kind of con.
get scammed or whatever.
They don't want to tell you about it. Like, they don't even want to tell you that because they kind of know that something fucked up has just happened.
Not to mention, but with Scientology, you also are routinely audited, in which you have to like divulge all sorts of like extremely personal things, and those things will be kept in binders, and then you will be reminded of them. That so is this still true about you? This is so you did touch yourself?
Really? Like a fucking tax audit?
That sounds like a system of confession designed to exploit a demand.
It does sound like that.
Funny
that.
They use these in their little struggle sessions.
There's a Scientology and Dianetics like learning shop on Tottenham Court Road, right next to the UCL campus. So we would see these dudes all the fucking time trying to fly at people, and we also like ran into a homeless guy one time who had just been there, and they'd basically given him like a free counseling session. But they started telling him about like his past lives and where he's carrying trauma from all this stuff, and he could learn more if he wants to, and all this. It was just like
that's a stupid move for them though, because why would they target someone that clearly is not well off? Like that's not really, or like has like expendable income. That like that seems like a very non-Scientology thing to do.
He also has nothing to lose in throwing all of his waking hours into laboring for them.
There's extremely like there's a really shitty conservative church over here that a lot of people call a cult that deliberately kind of targets disadvantaged Maori, like dudes that have just come out of prison and stuff, and they literally have like a biker gang kind of like stormtrooper setup, and it's all like dudes that have come out of jail and all this kind of stuff, and they are like, it's like the whole thing, like what Fanon says about the lumpen proletariat becoming staunch soldiers for the revolution sort of thing. It's like that, but like the bad way,
Okay.
I want to briefly make a note of something before I forget to, but cults can sometimes bring about positive changes in people, but it doesn't mean it's still not a cult. And for instance,
all the time.
So for instance, like, I mean, I don't know if Jordan Peterson's fandom is a cult, but people will say Jordan Peterson saved my life, and I legitimately believe that Jordan Peterson provided them some sort of sense of self and some sense of whatever. Or like Scientology denounces psychiatry, and they provide their own version of like whatever. And so someone will walk in there and be like, I hadn't like they oftentimes prey on addicts, where someone's addicted to a substance. Scientology gives them this whole system of beliefs and this whole like leveling up process and this validation. And then look, that they are no longer addicted to the substance because just they needed that void filled, they needed a sense of identity, all whatever. I'm not an addiction expert, but I don't want to discount the fact that those positive things actually do occur, but it's important to note that that doesn't mean that it's not a cult you're dealing with. I see a lot of people conflating this, and it's
completely essential to successful cults. It's one of the key aspects of them. I mean, so far I've only been talking about the manner in which cults exert control, because that was the initial focus of people who are researching cults. But because right now we're talking about we've been kind of like touching on stuff that this guy Lifton did. But the other person who I've used as a major source for this is a writer called Mark Galanter, who wrote a much more scientific study of cults, and essentially his book, and this is the book recommendation I would make. It's called Cults, Faith, Healing, and Coercion. It touches very heavily on the healing aspect of cults. And makes studies of Alcoholics Anonymous for one thing. But it also
Interesting.
of like religious groups, particularly the kinds that would offer spiritual healing and spiritual consultation, designed to alleviate mental distress. The alleviation, that's the same edition that I have here. Actually, I've got a very weird copy with lots of post-it notes stuck into it.
Oh, that's
brilliant.
That's great.
It's of his kind.
Yeah. Honestly, if I was to recommend like one book out of the ones I've been sifting through for this, I think this would be the one, because it's quite readable. It's very well sourced. still considered to be a reasonably respectable text in like the academic and medical communities that study this stuff. So it's you know, no single book is going to be bulletproof. This one is generally quite good. We'll get to that later, though. I'm just going to blitz through the remains of the Lifton stuff, though, because it's worth looking at it. Right, so the milieu control happens, and then it kind of, once that happens, the system begins to exert like a degree of like manipulation of people's inner spiritual lives, and the purpose here is to basically like break in and control patterns of behavior. Lifton says, in such a way that these will appear to have risen spontaneously from within the environment. The idea is that people begin to believe that they're on like a mystical journey that derives from them being in this particular grouping. That essentially there's a kind of effect of what he called planned spontaneity directed as it is by an ostensibly omniscient group. So basically,
so is that like the kind of situation where they like the leaders or whoever's in control are planning things to happen? So like like they like when you get those people that are convinced that they've been in like one of these evangelical churches and that they've seen a miracle happen in front of them, sort of thing. Is that the kind of thing?
Something that Pentecostalism is really good at is like great spectacular acts of faith healing. And they don't do this so much anymore, but they used to do a lot of stuff where people would like deliberately get bitten by snakes to prove that the snakes had power over them.
What the fuck?
So that was them kind of like demonstrating to their audience of new recruits that there's some kind of like great mystical force that is inherent in this group, and that the recruits' membership of this group is inherently mystically essential to their soul. And of course, once you've done that, you can begin exerting more specific and intellectual pressures on people, which is where we get to the demand for purity and the ideas of surrounding like confessional systems and sacred sciences. I mean, the demand for purity is basically what it sounds like. Any kind of like ideological or mental taint that's present is inherently bad. The totalist ideology is inherently pure. You must adhere to the totalist ideology, and deviation from it is impure in some way or another. Boilerplate stuff. Don't need to explain that one desperately deeply. And we've already touched on confession and sacred science. I mean, we're all brilliant dialectical materialists.
Of course, yeah.
Okay.
We've all got black belts. It's true.
Black belts and dialectical materialism.
Yeah. So the reason why I bring up dialectical materialism is one of the things that has amused me about particularly left-wing cults is they are absolutely brilliant at the next major thing that Lifton noted, which was jargon. We fucking love our complete gibberish. Like whether we're like talking about like dual power and mutual aid, or if it's like some
words that none of us know the meaning of.
Yeah, or whether it's like some abstract shit about like, I don't know, something that like Georgi Lukács wrote after the Hungarian Revolution, then Lord knows we've got some German compound word for it.
Yeah.
So yeah, the purpose of the in-group jargon, I mean, like Terry Pratchett said, the purpose of most slang is to annoy strangers.
He's right.
So to a certain extent, that is the purpose of jargon, but it's not the only purpose. Like one thing that kind of gets lifted from Lifton a lot is this concept of the thought terminating cliche, which is unfortunately one of those ideas that is so useful that it has become kind of like meaningless in its overuse. The idea was that it would be a particular pattern of phrases that someone would repeat that would have the psychological purpose of cutting off ideological exploration in a conversation or debate. So you'd be in a discussion with someone and they'd be like, "Oh, but you're just a stupid anarchid," or something like that.
Of course.
And it would be like, "Oh, fuck, well, not getting anywhere here. I guess this incredibly important Discord debate that I'm having about the Holodomor is just
at 3 a.m.
Yeah. I would never have such a debate at 3 a.m.
Or like God works in mysterious ways. Like this kind of
thing
that people are really frustrated by, right?
God works in mysterious ways, or I mean, there's the anti-vax movement, which is the case study that I was going to bring up towards the end of this, has fucking millions of these Like they actually, you know, their stickering campaign, which is one of the main things I've been interested in recently, is just like non-stop thought terminating cliches.
Someone who isn't me, who is making a strong case for debate bros acting in a cult-like fashion, could say that all debate bros do all day is teach their viewers not thought-terminating cliches to go and tell other people on Twitter. But not
absolutely.
me. I'm not the one saying that.
1000%.
Hypothetically, someone could.
Okay, so the thing that debate bros remind me of, which I think makes this connection quite tangible, is the degree of similarity in like the unconscious aspects of their behavior with sovereign citizens. Because what debate bros remind me of, regardless of whether or not the thing they're debating about is correct or not, they really remind me of the way that people behave when they turn up at police stations and insist that because of maritime law, every doctor that's handing out a COVID-19 vaccine must be immediately arrested.
Yeah. Or like, this cop can't arrest me for like shitting on the cenotaph in front of Wellington Parliament because he's not wearing his hat. You know?
Right, exactly. Or that like Magna Carta means that Edinburgh Castle is an independent country, which I think.
I remember that one. Yeah, that was one of the.
Yeah, Shad in the chat says absolutely. I can tell a follower of Vosh or Destiny or whoever by the insults they give, which is true. It's the
words.
It's very clear. 100%. You're like, oh, you learned that from blah blah. It's very obvious. You're repeating the rhetoric.
And that thing about performing miracles also reminded me that the leader of Falun Gong claims to be able to fly and claims to have demonstrated it in front of an entire like audience of viewers. So
you know what?
Like
the best thing, the shit that I love is. I would be
surprised if he had, you know,
if he could fly, you would be
in front of an audience, told them that he was flying and that they believed him.
That's what I mean. Yeah. That's exactly in line with what we've been saying. Like I think that it's a, you know, just conversations about mass hysteria have a lot of problems to them. But like to use that phrase for a minute, like, if you have a ton of people in the room who all are followers of this guy and they love him and they literally think he's space Jesus, which I think is literally what Falun Gong says. Like he is reincarnated Jesus, but he's also an alien from space. Then they would believe him if he was just like, see how I'm flying. Like they would all be like, yep.
Yeah, it's kind of
like there's a lot of weird shit in that with in martial arts movements as well. There's like all these earlier.
Like the one that's like
the guy that does like the
Steven fucking
Seagal.
Steven Seagal.
Yeah, Steven Seagal is like really into that. But there's like actually a whole bunch all over the world. Like I'm sure there's a guy in New Zealand, there's like an Australian dude, there's a bunch in America that like it's like it is a cult, seriously, you know, and they have all these like, you know, faithful kind of acolytes or whatever like that, and it's just like watching it, you're like, no, like this guy, you know, like the guy will be pretending to like shoot like little like chi blasts at people, and they'll be like, whoa, oh my god, you know, and it's like
I've seen that guy.
People are like so in on it that it's like, are they playing along, or do they actually believe this, or what?
Well, it gets to a point where they're obviously like so deep in the source and they're so invested in this like you know guy that can throw chi blasts for like whatever benefit that has in like modern society, like what, you know, who knows, but they just have to go along with it. They have to, because they're like, I guess, I don't know if you'll agree with this, Em, but like you said before, they're like the grandma that got hustled and is now, do you know what I mean, embarrassed to like talk about it and be like, bring it up and shit. So it's like, oh, I'll just go along with it. And then
I think once you've got to the point where people are doing like actual magic, you're kind of beyond grandma stage.
Yeah.
And like there's that really famous one about the breatharians.
Oh, okay, yeah.
You know about breatharians?
This one was really sad because people actually fucking died doing this.
Well, that's it. Yeah, people were like, you don't need to eat. You don't need to eat. You don't need to drink. That's it. You could just survive. It's the new form of vegetarianism. It's better than vegetarianism. Yeah. And like the main proponents of it were like, yeah, I've never eaten. But like they've been like discovered at multiple points, like their spouses have found receipts of like McDonald's, like in their bins and stuff.
Hang on, they did eat.
They did eat. They have to eat. There's no way you can't. It's impossible.
Yeah.
Fuck.
Otherwise, they would be like an extremely true believer for approximately 9 days, and then they would reset.
Okay, here's another thing I want to make sure that I'm right on. A cult leader can scam the cult followers, but not all cult leaders are scamming or are aware they're not necessarily in
Nah,
like
a
scamming.
lot of them- a
They
lot
can
of them
believe their own
fully-
garbage, is what I'm trying to say.
A lot of them fully believe what they're doing.
Yeah.
So the reason why I got into like making a focus on like cultic ideological formation, like ideological system formation as a component of my anti-fascism, is because I ran into a person online called Sarah Hightower.
That rings a
Anybody
bell.
know who that is?
It rings a bell.
Yeah, you might have seen her mentioned at some point. She's not particularly famous. She's a bit of a niche figure. Sarah's like a real expert on this stuff. She's de-radicalized hardline people. Her main interest in cults for a long time has been that she is probably one of like the world's greatest experts on a group called Aum Shinrikyo.
Oh yeah. Oh, I think I know who you mean now. Yeah,
What's it
yeah,
called? Alms?
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So this was a Japanese group. They still exist actually, although they had to rename for legal reasons. And they became very like strong during the late 80s and early 90s. And I can't remember what year it was in. I think it might have been 92. They was such a successful cult. They had like their own, basically like their own kind of like internal proto economy. Like, you know, they had like
Holy shit.
reasonably like sophisticated internal like logistics and governance systems. But the function of their belief was that they were under the impression that they were in an apocalyptic confrontation with the rest of the world, that only they knew the true path, and that their leader could fly, that he could do various different forms of like mystical magic, and that if they could unleash the power of weapons of mass destruction, they would be able to instigate the apocalypse. And because they had all become one with their leader in a great like act of spiritual unity, then they would be, you know, the chosen few that would survive.
Yeah,
Now, that is a grotesque simplification of the deep complexity of what went on with Aum, but that's kind of like the short version. And they ended up producing their own sarin gas and various other things, and bombing the Tokyo subway.
Oh, that's where I've heard of that. Yeah.
The like speaking of weapons of mass destruction, like people might be aware of Atomwaffen, the neo-Nazi sect who are hell-bent on getting control of nuclear weapons so they can begin the race war. Like I think it's relevant to note at this point, in case people hadn't caught up to this, that Nazis are almost exclusively deep in the Kool-Aid. Like the Nazism itself in the original Hitler sense was a big esoteric cult. The SS had their own religion. Like it was a whole ass thing going on, and neo-Nazis are very much the same, especially if they're hardcore enough people to be, well, fucking murderous terrorists like Atom. And what you were saying about the belief of an ongoing battle or an upcoming climactic war is very relevant, right? Because this is a type of conspiracy theory, millennialism. There is some special date coming on which everything is going to change. And I said this before we brought M on, but like there are certain shapes that conspiracy theories can take that have been identified, and one of them is that there are a few sort of basic shapes of this same story that's like the end is coming, or the time when we'll be judged is coming, or the time when all the good people will be victorious is coming. And they're various different forms, but like, you know, when we hear about doomsday cults, or we hear about Nazi cults thinking about the race war coming, or we hear about like QAnon talking about the storm or whatever, it's like that's because there's this kind of same story that's told a lot of the time.
I mean, the reason why I bring up Aum is because you asked, I think, was it, which one of you asked the question about do the leaders often believe their own bullshit?
I did.
Right, yes. So Aum was notable because it was really particularly a very high-profile case of the leaders really believing their own bullshit. Like the upper echelons of Aum thought that it was all true. The leader, a guy called Shoko Asahara, after the terrorist attacks, the Japanese government like launched a massive investigation, huge manhunts, and they eventually had to like pry him out of a hidden compartment in the walls of a building that was owned by the sect, and they chucked him in jail and gave him a death sentence. He was eventually executed many years later, I think about 5 years ago. The thing is that in the process of the trial, it essentially shattered his own personal belief system and the belief system of the other co-defendants, and he functionally became non-verbal for the rest of his life.
Fucking hell, that's heavy.
Because of the trauma of learning what he is responsible for?
Sorry,
Right,
that was the thing I was trying to say about Atomwaffen quickly, was just like when you hear about like these guys are Nazis who their plan is to like get nukes for something, you're like, that's a stupid plan. And then it's like, don't just assume that people who are trying to do something like that are just less intelligent. It's like, it's because their belief in reality is so warped.
Yeah. Tried to buy a nuke off the Russians.
Right.
During around about the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is when this stuff was going on.
Right.
This is the kind of the big ticket items that everybody knows about Alm, if they know anything about them, is that they made their own sarin, they tried to make their own biological weapons, and they tried to buy a nuke from the collapsing USSR. And that they had, a series of incredibly insane legal confrontations with the Japanese state and are now illegal. And the deeper story is much more complex and rich and deserves, I think, a much deeper knowledge than I can express in this much more generalized talk. I'm also not particularly competent to, because I'm not an expert in Alm. We should probably move on from them, lest I do the subject a disservice.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
So I guess like the stuff that we've mentioned there kind of like touches on the last kind of things that Lifton studied. He was also a big person for studying Aum Shinrikyo. But yeah, the final two things that he thought comprised the core of ideological totalism were the supremacy of the doctrine, and then like the dispensing of human existence, which is basically like you can figure out what these words mean. You know what this means? Like it means that the ideology becomes so like world-definingly important that the human self doesn't become important, and so you can do anything to your own body, you can do anything to someone else's, and it won't even make you sad or angry. You'll just kind of do them.
Right. Because you're just an ideological actor. Yeah.
Well, it's more that the ideological system had like so taken over the faculties of this collective of individuals that concept of actor kind of, I mean, it still applies in a strict sense, but it begins to blur around the margins as people become kind of like in their attempt to become vessels for a greater truth, they actually manage it, unfortunately. If you see what I mean.
And as you will soon find out, you cannot defeat an enemy that you cannot see.